The muscle cars of the 1960s were not just fast, they were dragons, factory-built, and masquerading as commuter cars, armed with secret 500 horsepower engines, skeletal frames full of holes, and quarter-mile traps set for the unwary. Official records downplayed their power. Behind closed doors, engineers pushed limits past sanity and safety, all to dominate America's drag strips. Why did Detroit put license plates on these ticking time bombs? The real story goes deeper than horsepower. In 1963, Chevrolet's engineering offices became a breeding ground for secrets. Deep inside the walls of General Motors, two men, Vince Piggins and Bill Tower, were quietly rewriting the rules of factory racing. The official word from General Motors leadership was clear: no more racing. But outside the boardroom, Piggins and Tower saw an opportunity to keep Chevrolet's name at the top of the drag strip leaderboards. Their weapon would be the Impala Z11, a car that barely resembled anything else on the street, yet wore a license plate like any commuter sedan. Only about 50 of these Z11s ever left the factory, each one built under a veil of paperwork labeled Promotion Special. The idea was to slip these cars into the hands of trusted racers without drawing attention from upper management or the press. No dealer brochures, no magazine ads, just a handful of phone calls and a short list of names who knew how to keep quiet. The Z11's 427 cubic inch V8 was officially rated at 430 horsepower. But dyno sheets from the era tell a different story. Test after test landed north of 500 horsepower, with some numbers pushing as high as 510. That is nearly double what most American cars made at the time, and enough to propel the Z11 through the quarter mile in the mid-10-second range straight off the showroom floor. The lengths to which Piggins and Tower went to hide the Z11's true nature bordered on espionage. Factory order forms disguised the car's purpose, listing vague option codes and omitting mention of the race-bred internals. Even the engine castings were unique, with high-rise intakes and aluminum body panels that shaved precious weight. The result was a car that looked just enough like a regular Impala to pass inspection, but underneath it was a purebred drag racer. Every Z11 built was a chess move in a war that General Motors was not supposed to be fighting. The handful of cars that made it into private hands became instant legends, their real power whispered about at drag strips and in garage circles. Each run down the quarter mile was a middle finger to the rule book and a warning shot to rival brands. The Z11 did not just bend the rules, it buried them under a cloud of tire smoke and untraceable paperwork. Pontiac's engineers faced a challenge that demanded more than just horsepower. In 1963, the drag racing world was obsessed with shedding every ounce of unnecessary weight. While Chevrolet's Z11 relied on secrecy and subtle modifications, Pontiac chose a different, far more visible approach. Their answer was the Catalina Super Duty, nicknamed the Swiss cheese car. The origin of that name is no mystery. Pontiac's team drilled more than 50 large, round holes through the boxed sections of the car's steel frame. Each hole measured about 1.5 inches across, and they ran the length of the rails, like a row of portholes in a ship's hull. The result was a frame that looked more like a piece of Emmental than any Detroit chassis before or since. This radical surgery cut nearly 200 pounds from the car's structure, an advantage that could mean the difference between winning and losing on the strip. Only 14 of these cars were ever built. Each one was a calculated risk, a rolling experiment in how far a factory could push engineering before crossing the line into disaster. The engineers relied on stress calculations and prototype testing to reassure themselves that the frames would not twist or collapse under the strain of a full power launch. In practice, the gamble paid off. The Swiss cheese Catalinas tore down the quarter-mile in just over 11 seconds, at speeds topping 120 miles per hour. Drivers like Mickey Thompson racked up wins without a single reported frame failure during the 1963 season. Unlike the shadow games at Chevrolet, Pontiac's approach was impossible to hide. Anyone who looked underneath could see the frame's drastic weight loss plan. The cars wore their modifications openly, a badge of mechanical audacity that set them apart at the track. Decades later, that same boldness has turned the Swiss cheese cars into collector legends. At auction, one recently changed hands for $742,500. The price reflects not just rarity, but the sheer nerve it took to build them in the first place. Pontiac's drilled frame Catalinas closed out GM's era of factory drag racing with a display of visible, unapologetic ingenuity. The Swiss cheese experiment stands as proof that, for a brief moment, the only rule was to go faster, no matter how wild the solution. Thunderbolt was not just a name, it was a warning. Ford's engineers, led by Chuck Cinco and racer Dick Brannon, set out to build a car that would leave the competition stunned and scrambling for answers. Deep inside the Dearborn foundry, after hours, they fitted a Fairlane with the most ferocious engine Ford had ever made. The 427 cubic inch side oiler V8 engine. Officially rated at 425 horsepower, insiders and dyno sheets pointed to a real figure closer to 540. The car's body panels were swapped for fiberglass, the battery shoved into the trunk for better weight transfer, and the interior stripped of anything that did not make it go faster. Even the windows were replaced with thin plexiglass. Out of these late-night experiments rolled a machine that sounded like thunder and hit the strip with the force of a lightning bolt. The Thunderbolt was not a mass-market car. Ford built only 100, each one spoken for before it ever left the line. These cars were not sold through glossy brochures. They were handed over to racers who knew exactly what they were getting and exactly how to use it. The glove box of every Thunderbolt carried a warning. This car was built for supervised acceleration trials, not daily errands. But the line between street and strip blurred, and the Thunderbolt was technically street legal, barely. The fact that they were all spoken for only underscored how targeted these machines were. In February 1964, the Thunderbolt made its intentions clear at the NHRA Winter Nationals. Bob Novak lined up against Bill Jenkins's Dodge Hemi. The Ford blasted off the line, tires clawing for grip, and crossed the quarter mile in 11.58 seconds at 123 miles per hour. The margin of victory was 0.2 of a second, an eternity in drag racing. The crowd roared. Ford's gamble had paid off, and the Thunderbolt became the car everyone else had to chase. Cinco and Brannon's creation did not just win races, it forced the drag racing world to pay attention. The Thunderbolt's domination on the strip pushed rivals to rethink what was possible from a factory, and it put a spotlight on the arms race happening in Detroit back rooms. For a brief moment, the Thunderbolt was the king of the quarter mile, a symbol of what happened when engineers were given free rein and a blank check. The drag war was now out in eon, and the rules of engagement had changed forever. Ford's next move took secrecy and exclusivity to a level even the Thunderbolt had not reached. In 1966, the Fairlane 500 R code was not just rare, it was locked down from the start. Only 57 units ever left the assembly line, and not a single one was offered to the public. There were no order sheets, no dealer allocations, and not even a hint in Ford's performance catalogs. The R code was built for one reason: to win on the drag strip, with the factory controlling every step of its journey. Internal memos dictated that these cars go straight to select racing teams and trusted insiders. Ford's own documentation spelled out the rules: no sales to private buyers, no exceptions for well-connected dealers. The cars were delivered with specific paperwork clarifying their intended use: racing, not retail. Each R code wore a 427 cubic inch V8, officially rated at 425 horsepower. But period tests and racer accounts put the real number over 500. The bodies were stripped of anything unnecessary, with lightweight components and reinforced frames to handle the brutal launches expected at the track. Collectors today hunt for these cars like lost treasure. With only 57 built and so few survivors, the R-code Fairlanes have become some of the most valuable artifacts of the muscle car era. Auction records show prices regularly topping $250,000, with original documentation and race history driving values even higher. For most enthusiasts, the R code remains a legend glimpsed only in grainy photos and old race footage, a symbol of how far manufacturers would go to control not just who raced their cars, but who even got to see them. This was a different kind of factory drag car. Instead of bending the rules to slip a handful of monsters into private hands, Ford clamped down and drew a hard line. The R-code Fairlane was not a secret to be whispered about in garages. It was a weapon, issued only to the chosen few, with the full weight of corporate policy behind it. For everyone else, the showroom stayed empty, and the legend grew with every pass down the quarter mile. Dodge engineers didn't just chase horsepower, they tore up the rule book on what a car could look like. In 1965, the Coronet A990 became ground zero for a new kind of drag racing machine. Tom Hoover, already known as the father of the Hemi, had one question on his mind: how do you get all that power to the pavement? Hoover's team took the Coronet's rear axle and moved it forward by 12 inches, and the front wheels slid back 4 inches. This was not a tweak. It was a surgical shift that changed the car's entire stance and weight distribution. Suddenly, the A990 looked almost cartoonish, with rear wheels jammed up into the quarter panels and the nose pointing like a missile. Racers and fans started calling them funny cars. The name stuck, and a whole new class was born. The altered wheelbase gave the A990 a launch advantage no one had seen before. With more weight over the rear tires, traction improved dramatically. Instead of spinning in a cloud of smoke, the car hooked up and shot down the track. The debut of the 426 cubic inch Hemi in this setup pushed real horsepower well past the advertised 425. Quarter-mile times dropped into the low 11-second range, with some even flirting with the 10-second range, numbers that forced the NHRA to rethink its own rules. Tom Hoover's gamble did not just win races, it changed the physics of drag racing. The A990's radical approach set the stage for the wild fiberglass-bodied monsters that would come next. From this point on, the battle was not just about raw power, it was about who could bend the laws of traction and geometry the farthest. The 1968 Dodge Hemi Dart did not just push the envelope, it shredded it. Chrysler's engineers, led by Tom Hoover, took a compact Dart body and stripped it to the bone. Steel fenders and hood were replaced with hand-laid fiberglass. Side windows became thin, wobbly plexiglass. Even the door hinges were drilled out to save a few ounces. What remained weighed just under 3,000 pounds, hundreds lighter than anything else in its class, and barely more than a compact sedan. Then came the engine. The 426 cubic inch Hemi was never meant for a car this small. It was rated at 425 horsepower on paper, but real-world numbers from period dynos and drag strips landed closer to 550. With a pair of Holley carburetors and an open exhaust, the Dart could rip through the quarter mile in the low tens, territory reserved for dedicated race cars, not something with a license plate bracket. But the Hemi Dart story is not just about raw speed. It is about loopholes and legitimacy. Chrysler built around 80 of these cars, sending unfinished shells to Hearst for final assembly. Many left the plant without standard vehicle identification numbers or basic street equipment. Some cars carried a disclaimer that they were for track use only. Yet for homologation, a handful were registered as street vehicles, at least on paper. Collectors and historians still debate which Darts are real factory cars and which are later clones, because murky records and vehicle identification number anomalies followed these cars from day one. The Hemi Dart was a rolling contradiction, too wild for the street, too raw to hide. It set the stage for the next, even rarer monster in Chrysler's arsenal, and it left a legacy of controversy that still sparks arguments in drag racing circles today. Nothing in the muscle car wars matched the audacity of the 1968 Plymouth Hemi Barracuda. Chrysler built just 50 of these machines, each one a factory-issued threat to the very idea of street legality. The Barracuda didn't just push boundaries, it ignored them completely. Under the hood, the Hemi engine was tuned far beyond the official numbers. In race trim, dyno sheets from the period recorded figures closing in on 600 horsepower. That kind of power in a lightweight shell meant quarter-mile times that dipped into the nines, outpacing even the infamous Hemi Dart. There was no pretense here, no attempt to disguise the car's purpose or tone down its menace. Plymouth shipped these cars with a disclaimer stamped right onto the paperwork that read, "Track use only." Even the most hardened drag racers had to pause and read the fine print. The warning wasn't legal theater. It was a genuine attempt to distance the factory from what might happen if someone tried to tame this beast on public roads. The Barracuda came with the bare minimum for registration, lights, a horn, and a vehicle identification number. Everything else was stripped or swapped for lighter, race-ready parts. The seats were thin shells. The exhaust was barely muffled. On race gas, the car shook and snarled, refusing to idle politely at stoplights. Insurance companies wanted nothing to do with it. Dealers handed over the keys with a mix of pride and anxiety. Collectors count fewer than 20 survivors today, each one a relic of a moment when the rules simply didn't apply. The Hemi Barracuda stands as the most extreme example of the era's excess, a car so dangerous, so rare, and so unapologetically fast that even its creators felt compelled to warn the world. It was the last wild leap of factory muscle, before the door slammed shut on Detroit's age of sanctioned insanity. Today, automakers face tighter regulations and digital oversight, but the appetite for unchecked speed endures, evident in street racing crackdowns and the aftermarket horsepower arms race. The legacy of factory drag cars of the 1960s still shapes what drivers demand and what engineers dare to build. Every time a modern machine pushes the limit, it's a reminder. Risk and innovation still ride side by side. What would you drive if nothing held you back?